Welcome to One of 200, the Media and Politics podcast. I'm joined today by Niamh O'Flynn, the Program Director for Greenpeace. How are you doing, Niamh?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. We've been doing a little bit of work with Anti-War Aotearoa, of which I'm a spokesperson, and we've been working directly with Greenpeace to deliver some comms, work towards a march later in June. If you've been listening to the podcast, you would have heard some of our or seen some of our live streamed panels with experts talking around the illegal war in Iran. And we've seen this growing, I guess I'd say, support for a more anti-war or maybe you'd say pro-peace stance with different groups coming online to support that kaupapa. Awa reached out to Greenpeace to work with us on delivering this March for Peace happening on the 20th of June. I think that's right.
That's
I
right.
have to date check myself. And Greenpeace were really happy to come on board. And we want to talk a bit about that today. Talk about why Greenpeace has decided to get involved. Maybe talk a little bit about the history of Greenpeace's activism in some of these spaces. And then some of the core demands that are being considered and that are going to be discussed and demanded of the government during the march itself. So I think probably to start with, it would be good for our audience to understand what a program director does at Greenpeace and some of your background in the activist space.
Yeah. I don't know if program director is a job title that exists outside of Greenpeace. So fair enough if no one knows what it is. I feel like I now know. So I've been the program director here for about 6 years, and most of the time what I'm doing, I manage our comms team, our campaigners, and our actions and mobilization team. So it's all that kind of public-facing campaign work that we do. And what I'm trying to get the balance right on is obviously Greenpeace is an international organization. So we work to protect nature and we work for peace at a global level. And what I'm trying to do here in Aotearoa is build a program that is globally impactful while also being domestically relevant. So it's what can we work on in Aotearoa that we can scale up to make a difference at a global level.
It's one of those really interesting and challenging questions, right? And I think there are going to be threads of that throughout the wider discussion of the next few years, but certainly tracking back through our political history around this idea of New Zealand's independent foreign policy and the chance to be like the little guy on the big stage who is able to make a difference and like swing things behind a popular kind of set of decisions in terms of global politics. Can you give some examples of ways in which you take a campaign here or a global campaign and apply it in Aotearoa instead, or scale it up from an Aotearoa campaign into something that you can take more global?
Yes, really good examples. One pretty good example, I think, is our freshwater campaign. That's an agriculture and dairy campaign. So we focus on that, one, because agriculture is the biggest climate and biodiversity killer here in Aotearoa. But that doesn't necessarily mean anything at the global stage. But where it does mean something is that New Zealand has an outsized lobbying influence on global climate policy around culture. And for example, how globally we measure methane, which is the greenhouse gas that comes from farming cows. Yeah, so while the kind of pollution that's happening here in Aotearoa, the climate pollution maybe isn't that big in and of itself on a global scale, the outsized influence that New Zealand has on that global climate lobbying sphere, especially when it's related to farming or methane, is really important to tackle. And so when people look to Aotearoa, New Zealand, they see clean, green New Zealand. They're obviously doing farming right. You know, our cows are outside eating grass, and they listen to us about how farming should happen without seeing the flip side of that, which is you can't swim in a heap of the rivers. People are drinking water polluted with nitrates. And so actually by targeting the dairy industry here in Aotearoa, you can have a global impact through that work. So that's a kind of example of one of those areas. And I think that is also true for peace work. You might say, you know, we're pretty small here in New Zealand. What does it matter what we do? But I think if you look back at kind of nuclear-free policy, it really does matter when a small country stands up and says, hey, this is the right thing.
Because Greenpeace was quite actively involved with that as well, right? Like, and I think most people in this country will know some of the history of that. But how does that, you know, as someone in a leadership role at Greenpeace now, how do you track back to that history of activism around the nuclear free stuff, and how it was connected to conflict and kind of global politics.
Yeah, I think we still have a really strong connection to peace work as an organization because of that campaign. So last year here in Auckland, we commemorated the 40th anniversary of the bombing of the original Rainbow Warrior. And it was a really beautiful moment because we had people from all across Aotearoa coming down to the ports in Auckland to come and see the ship, but people who had kind of seen the original warrior as she'd been bombed. We had detectives who'd worked on the case. We had, like, everyone you meet has some story that connects them to the Rainbow Warrior, and then by kind of extension to the campaign for a nuclear-free and independent Pacific, right? So as a global organization, I think we really hold tight to that story. And one of the things that really struck me while I was talking to people, thousands of people who were coming to see the boat, was just how brave people were back then, standing up, putting their bodies on the line to say, actually, foreign powers can't just nuclear test here in the Pacific. And as a country here in Aotearoa, we need to stand up against that, and we need to take a really strong stance. And that it wasn't just this campaign that people were brave and acted on and the world changed overnight. They were campaigning over like 20 years
Yeah.
and seeing kind of incremental changes, and then this kind of whole mammoth shift. And now I think in Aotearoa, even when we have ministers speculating on whether or not we lose our nuclear-free status, the Prime Minister has to come out and be like, oh actually, no. Because we as a nation now hold that so strongly to our identity.
Yeah, and I probably don't remember back that far quite, but I do remember back even 20 years ago with Afghanistan and Iraq, and the huge number of people out who didn't want to be involved in an illegal US war. It was really, really clear that there was a public sentiment here that was vociferously against being involved in something like that. It feels like I don't know if shifted is the right word over the last 20 years, but people are burnt out on it a bit, people feeling a bit hopeless about it. There's a bit of, we're just a little guy kind of feeling from maybe not the wider activist community, but definitely the wider electorate. And this has been in an environment where an increasing number of atrocities are occurring. We've got the genocide in Gaza, the accelerating genocide. It hasn't stopped despite the so-called ceasefire. We've got the attacks on Yemen, the attacks on Lebanon, the attacks on Syria, as well as this illegal war in Iran, which it is the 9th of June right now when we're recording. So there's just been another exchange of attacks between Iran, Israel, and Yemen. And you don't see those same numbers of people in the streets that I remember from the Iraq War and the No Blood for Oil campaign. What are your thoughts on what's changed there, and maybe what people are looking for in terms of what can we march about, how can we have an impact?
Mm. Yeah, I think we're really seeing, as you were kind of talking about, this like flooding the zone concept playing out very much in favor of kind of right-wing warmongering politics, right? So it's, if you're a progressive person who cares about people and who cares about the planet and wants a peaceful world, it feels like there's any number of things you could be protesting all day, every day, and still not scratch the surface, right? I think we're all probably feeling that to some extent. And then doing things that maybe don't feel like they're adding up to enough. And it is really disempowering, over long periods of time. We're feeling like, oh, we've been protesting these kind of wars for decades and they're still going on. And I think the thing that we really need to do as campaigners in Aotearoa is find the thing where we actually can move the dial from here in Aotearoa. It's like, maybe we can't shift US foreign policy, but maybe we can shift what's happening and our complicity in it and change that. And I think the other thing that we shouldn't forget is the power of just turning up and showing resistance to people who are on the ground in situations that are kind of unimaginable for most of us. Like we have an office, our Middle East and North Africa office in Greenpeace, and a lot of our colleagues live and work in Lebanon, and they're working to protect the planet in pretty awful conditions. I think my counterpart was talking about having lived through like 4 wars, lived and worked through 4 wars or something. I don't know if I've got that number right, but that's the kind of side of it. And he talks about just how important it is to see people from all over the world standing up and saying, actually, we don't back this, and we don't think this is okay, and we think your lives matter. And so I also think we need to remember that is important too, even if we're not necessarily changing policy every time we're out on the streets. We're showing that we don't think this is okay, and it's not in our name.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think right now the one very, the silver lining is that actually New Zealand does have complicity right now in a lot of this, and so there are pieces that we can tackle as activists in Aotearoa that can actually make some difference to some of the atrocities happening at the behest of Trump and Netanyahu.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where there's that complicity of not speaking up, right? And not
Mm-hmm.
condemning it, and providing like public relations cover. But there's also like business connections, which and then policy connections now as well, showing up here and there, where the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, can actually demand something from the government, and have a material impact if they're able to get those across the line. And we'll talk about those in a couple of minutes. But I just wanted to ask as
Oh,
well. So our reached out and asked if Greenpeace wanted to be involved in this kaupapa with the March for Peace. What was the calculus there for Greenpeace around giving logistical support and being part of the organizing for that march?
I think for us, we see campaigning for peace and campaigning to protect nature as kind of inextricably linked. I don't think you can't have, peace for people or a healthy environment while kind of the two are out of balance. So we see them as really, really deeply tied. And I think like we don't necessarily see ourselves in Aotearoa as the group that's the most expert at campaigning for peace or against war. That's something that this country has such a long, strong history of. So we're definitely not the experts in this. So often our support is kind of behind the scenes, or we do activist training, or we'll have volunteer nights or that kind of behind the scenes stuff. But I think on this one, we felt like there's some quite clear overlap between the war on nature and Trump supporting, Luxon, hard to keep the two straight in your head sometimes, and Luxon's kind of support for the Trump administration's war. So for us, it felt a really clear time to align publicly on this. And I guess globally, as Greenpeace, we've had one of our ships, the Arctic Sunrise, out supporting the Samud Flotilla. So we've got lots of behind the scenes bits of it happening. Yeah, so it's pretty aligned for us. And I don't know, maybe we'll get to it in a little bit about the critical minerals piece, but that's also kind of core for us.
Yeah, this is one of those kind of continuing threads of the military industrial complex, right? Is the damage of that just existing to the environment, to the use of military weapons is just enormous, like far more than almost any other impact over the short time that these weapons are being used.
Yeah, totally. Just the emissions of war alone is a good enough case, right? And I mean, even just how much the industries that we're fighting as environmentalists profit from war like this. I mean, you've just seen the kind of 6 oil majors having their profits jump by billions in the weeks after Trump starts attacking Iran. Like it's the same villains over and over profit from this exploitation of people and nature.
So this is one of the key demands of the March for Peace, which is tied directly into some of the work that Greenpeace has been doing. And that is that New Zealand must refuse any war minerals deal with the Trump administration. Do you want to talk a little bit around, so it's known in the mainstream and in terms of how it's being interacted with by our politicians as a critical minerals deal. I think it was last month when St. Peters was over there talking to Marco Rubio about it in the United States. What does Greenpeace see as the risks of that critical mineral deal, and why are we calling it a war minerals deal?
Yeah, it's super fascinating, this deal, because I first heard about it, I think, in January, and I was overseas actually at a meeting of other people who do similar work for Greenpeace, and saw this article pop up, and I was like, what? And I was talking about it with other people who work for Greenpeace around the world, being like, look what our ministers are talking about doing. They're talking about signing this critical minerals deal with the US, which basically at this point looks like the US gets kind of easy access to the minerals mined or dredged or whatever in Aotearoa, which seemed wild. And I think other people around the world couldn't believe that that was something that New Zealand was looking at doing, which is, it's always a nice sense check because it seems wild here, but then when you're with other people around the world, like, really? New Zealand's doing that? And it's good to be across that. And then I guess as the media started doing some digging, and, you know, we were doing a lot of behind the scenes digging, it starts to become apparent that actually, you know, the government has been negotiating this for some time and looking at signing this deal, and that Trump is essentially looking to stockpile what he considers critical minerals, we call war minerals, for his war efforts around the world. And one of the big links for us that we've been looking at quite closely is we've been fighting this seabed mining project off the coast of Taranaki and the South Taranaki Bight for well over a decade now. So they basically want to be able to mine the seabed in South Taranaki for this mineral called vanadium. And we and Ngāti Ruanui and Ngāruahine and Kiwis Against Seabed Mining, basically everyone in New Zealand, wildly, we're on the same side as the fishing industry on this one, the offshore wind industry, the wreck fishers, everybody thinks that seabed mining in the South Taranaki Bight is a terrible idea. However, there's been a lot of kind of government and industry push for this to happen. And we've beaten them through the EPA, we've beaten them through the High Court, through the Supreme Court, and then boom, the fast track comes around and we have to fight this project again through the fast track. And it's like they're kind of using any angle they can get to get this project over the line. And then just as that, the fast track application for this seabed mining project was failing, at the same time Shane Jones was announcing, oh, we're going to designate critical minerals zones. Which would mean we'd have different rules for how you can access the minerals in those places. And again, we don't really know any details about it. He just announces it. And we're like, oh, this feels like the next way that you get this project that you really want to see off the ground. So it feels dodgy. And the interesting thing that's going on there is that vanadium is one of the minerals on this list in the deal that the government's looking at signing up to with the US. And vanadium is used in munitions manufacture predominantly. So basically, where we think this is heading is that we would look at mining the seabed so that Trump can stockpile vanadium so that he can keep bombing Iran or keep supporting the war in Gaza, or, you know, whatever. And then recently as well, we've had these changes coming to conservation laws, which are looking like it's going to open up huge tracts of conservation land to further mining. So what we're seeing is that the Luxon government is pretty happily looking to kind of sell off big chunks of the places that people in Aotearoa hold dear to go and do really awful things that most people in New Zealand wouldn't stand for overseas, and that most of us really don't want to see happen. And so we are kind of relabeling. We don't think these minerals are not critical. These minerals are very much for making munitions. That's why we call them war minerals instead of critical minerals. And it really does feel like this government kind of cozying up to Trump and Netanyahu at the expense of New Zealand, our environment, and our independent foreign policy.
Kia ora. Yeah, we had someone from Kiwis Against Seabed Mining on for a longer episode to talk particularly about that one project. So if anyone wants to have a listen, you can go back a month or so and find that one as well, because it's really the history of that entire campaign is really interesting.
Fascinating. It's a fascinating example of like someone or some government being so ideologically driven that they're like, we're going to get this project over the line, despite it not being economic and despite no one wanting it and despite it wrecking the environment. It's phenomenal.
And I guess across different governments as well.
Yeah.
It's just kind of been ticking away in the background. Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
Can I add something on that?
Yeah,
just to saying with previous governments as well. I think that's the other thing that we have to remember while we're opposing the war efforts here right now, is it's not just about saying, oh, we've got the Luxon government that does terrible things, let's get rid of them and move on and it's all better. It's like, actually, we really need to make sure that the opposition is taking strong policies and not just saying nice things on paper right now. Well, it's easy to, or difficult to, as it seems to be for Labour to get policies out the door right now. we actually need to be able to hold them to account too, and not just relax and say, oh, the worst is over. We need to be able to actually make sure that Labour is putting real policy in place to stop things like this from happening, because otherwise we're having the same fights year after year. And in my mind, a really great example of when policy kind of meets the needs of the movement on the ground was the offshore oil and gas ban. And it could seem like just icing on the cake to have the policy of Labour coming in and banning offshore oil and gas after a decade of massive grassroots campaigning. But really, getting offshore oil and gas off the ground in Aotearoa has been impossible for this government that has really, really desperately tried to get it off the ground again. They've overturned the policy, but it turned out like the policy wasn't the thing that mattered. The policy was the thing that locked us into this being our future.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the kind of thing we're looking for, is really strong policies that set up how we as a country are and what kind of future we're looking towards. And I think that's what we really need to be pushing to. It's not just enough to not actively do all the bad things. We have to gear ourselves up to being, proactive about the kind of country we want to be.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, because with a lot of mobilizations, it can often be like, okay, we turned up, we said some things, and then a politician acquiesced, right? But these demands aren't just for the current government. Although, we'd love it if they acted on it immediately, if there's able to be enough support, enough clear outrage about this stuff that even the national coalition government turns around and goes, oh, actually, we want to step back from this. But we're in an election year. And so the demand is also to the Labour Party, should they win, to take on board some of these demands as well. Because what's the point if you just switch it and then they do have some continuity with that US relationship, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what we should be really pushing towards, is that kind of locked in way of being as New Zealand.
Yeah, I think over the last few years, even through the Ardern governments, there has been this thread of closer, what they call interoperability with the US military. That's been a continuing policy choice under successive governments of both red and blue flavors. And so at some point there has to be a hard stop. Whether or not it's coming in this election is one thing, but I guess that's part of what the March for Peace is about as well. So we've
And
got
it
a bunch
doesn't
of
matter where it comes from. It just needs to happen. And I think for most of us, we don't care which party it is that, gets good policy over the line and keeps New Zealand out of these wars. It's like, we just need it to happen.
It's one of those really interesting issues, because I think last poll I saw had something like over 80% of New Zealanders didn't want New Zealand involved in the illegal war in Iran. So it seems like it's a election winning issue, but Labour have been not super vociferous about it either. And National certainly have chosen just to ignore it.
Yeah, and I think most of the rhetoric's been around kind of cost of living. How does this war contribute to the cost of petrol for New Zealanders, which is obviously valid and relevant, but only a very small part of the story, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that two of these other demands, the first couple of demands on the list, speak to that a little more closely, not the cost of living, but the engagement with the war. So it's condemnation of the war, which hasn't happened under this government, and then a call for there to be no military support or deployment of New Zealand troops in the region. Now, that hasn't looked very likely as of yet, but from a campaigning perspective, how do you see that as trying to shape the government decision making and maybe get some outcomes that New Zealanders appreciate?
I think in terms of that particular one, I think it's like we just had the budget come out, right, with a pretty decent increase in military spending. And I think that kind of tells you about where a government's priorities are sitting, right? And we're seeing healthcare and cost of living and all of these services that New Zealanders rely on and having a healthy society rely on being seriously underfunded. And so, yes, you could say no more military spending, but I think also there's a really nice, clear line in the sand when you say we're not sending people to this. And I think it was over military spending, wasn't it, when the US was saying we were freeloaders. that I think that's the narrative we want to have, right? Is like, yeah, you can do this, and maybe we're allies on some things, but we're never sending people to your wars. So it's a to me a really good line in the sand that we should maintain. And having nice, clear bottom lines, I think, is important, and it's important for people to be able to understand them too.
I think this one's actually pretty easy
Mm,
to implement as well, right? Like we're already not sending anyone over there as far as we know, and it's almost just a continuation or a commitment, and particularly in light of the election coming up and how the war in Iran might develop over the next, what, 6 to 8 months.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those lines in the sand that, if you can stop something bad before it starts, it's much nicer and tidier. And if we can have a really clear commitment that we're not sending people, it's better that we can say that now when it feels like a given than later if it's going and starting.
One of the other ones has been a little bit more difficult for activists to get movement on. So the fourth demand is sanctions on Israel to help end the genocide in Palestine. In terms of building narrative support for, I guess, or in circumstances where a government or a decision-making body has just shown zero inclination to change direction. Is there anything that Greenpeace has been able to action or strategize in the past to reignite those? I mean, because this has been happening since 2023, right? There have been demands for this since 2023 to expel the ambassador, to put sanctions on Israel, to uphold things from the International Criminal Court, and etc. And the National Coalition government is basically just ignores it altogether. There might be some little bits of PR now and then. So like, oh, we don't like seeing people die, but definitely no change in policy direction in regards to statements such as Israel has a right to self-defense, or any meaningful material policies that will have an impact on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, in terms of to try and answer that doozy of a question, I think like in short, there are some Zionists in this coalition government, which makes it tricky. They are. They say it, they're happy, they're proud about it. And I think it's not just about do people want this thing to happen? It's, I think, is there enough manufactured uncertainty about this issue that they can hide behind or not? And in this case, I would say yes. And to me, it kind of has the same smell as 10 years ago talking about climate change, where like you could still say, the jury's out on whether it's real, we need more science, blah, 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 when we were still playing that game. And the government could kind of hide behind, oh, well, you think this, but not everyone thinks this right now. Whereas now they have to do a different kind of climate denial. And I would say sanctioning Israel sits very squarely in that same kind of camp where they can say, oh, well, people are anti-Semitic if they think this and they think that. And there's a whole lot of mixed opinions. And I think people more inclined to our worldview see that as entirely manufactured Zionist crap. But I think it provides this kind of, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but if it provides this kind of cover for the government to not have to actually do much, even if most people want it, because I think if you're not paying close attention, you can still maybe think that there are two sides to a story in the way that people did for a long time on climate change. And I think the more you're involved in campaigning and in current events and power like this, you realize sometimes there's not two sides to a story. Sometimes there's the story and then there's people trying to confuse the story. And I think that's a pretty clear example. So to me, it's about how do we make sure that the waters become unmuddied. And I think obviously the longer this despicable genocide goes on, the more clear that is becoming. But I don't think this government, or probably, I don't know where the next government will be if it's a change, but they're not even fast followers usually. So it has to be pretty clear cut. So I think the more kind of opposition that's happening to the genocide in Gaza, the more we start to, make that shift.
Yeah, that's really, thank you for that. Sorry, I put you on the spot a bit with that one. But
I might change my mind tomorrow, but that's where I'm at today.
The reason I ask about that in particular is to take it back to the start of a conversation around people being burnt out, and not knowing what thing to stand up for or get out for. There's just so much going on. And there have been consistent, weekly rallies across the country in solidarity with Palestine. And we had that one like amazing solidarity march, which I think up to 50K people through Auckland. But it feels like you just need so much more to get movement than even weekly rallies and like huge turnouts and polling showing that these things need to shift if politicians are going to say that they actually are representatives. So yeah, useful to think about that in terms of why it is the way it is and what the actual challenge is, rather than just kind of throwing ourselves against a wall,
Mm,
thinking, okay, the wall's gonna break eventually, which may be the case, but if we can somehow make it clearer in other ways as well, maybe that can help tip the decision-making scales a little.
And I think being really specific about what we're asking is really important there too, because I think that was one of the things that the climate movement learned the hard lesson on, was just saying like take climate action for a long time, and it becomes one, it's really hard for people to know what to do, like people in power to know like what would meet your expectations on what that is, but also it's hard to know if it's actually happened. It allows a lot of vagary and hiding, and so I think we should always be looking for what specific things we can ask for and where we can take action on things that make individual decision makers or power holders feel heat, whether that's people in decision making power at Rocket Lab or MPs or wherever that is.
Yeah, fantastic. I just want to talk about this last demand as well, which is, I guess, a little more academic, which is to consistently uphold the UN Charter and support the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice regarding the war crimes occurring just in so many places at this point. But that speaks really strongly to this idea that Aotearoa New Zealand can at least add its voice and scale upwards into global politics, even if we are just some little country down here.
Yeah, and we do hold power in those spaces, not always, but often. And I think it's not a given, right, that New Zealand turns up in those spaces and takes the right side of history. Like certainly on like fisheries, we don't. We go in and we wreck the thing when there's that kind of global multilateral conversations happening on fisheries. So I think it's really important that we push for that. And I think the whole global order that we rely on is people working together in good faith. And certainly I am someone who's hugely skeptical of a lot of like UN processes and people spending a lot of time and resources sitting in big UN meetings. But ultimately, I think we kind of rely on there being this global multilateral cooperation that underpins the way that governments do business and work together. And right now we're seeing particularly the US government just throwing that as far as they can and crushing it. And so I think it's really important, especially for small countries who don't have that kind of might, to stand up for it, because it's one of the only things that that kind of gives us any sway at all. So I do think it's really, really important for us to hold those lines and to be a force for good in those spaces. And sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. So I think keeping the pressure on is important.
We need to get a list of all the times we're not and all the times we are, and we just like slowly move them from one
Tally
column to
them.
the other. Yeah, yeah. How do we measure up on balance? Not very well, I think at this point.
Yeah, but people love to, like you see the power of New Zealand sometimes, like when you think of like COVID response and like the whole world loved Jacinda Ardern, and like that doesn't account for what happened here after the fact. But
Hmm.
but people really looked to New Zealand for how that whole thing was handled. And they looked to, oh, Jacinda was managing 5 million people. It didn't matter that she wasn't managing a massive, massive country with a huge population. It was the approach that was admired. And I think that's something that we can do.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities there that people often write off, either because it's expedient for them to do so, or maybe just because they just feel hopeless, right? Uh,
Yeah.
but sometimes having like a small population down, isolated away from everything else, gives you those opportunities to do something really different, to speak up in ways that other people can't, to design and respond to something in ways that other people can't, and provide like a possibility of best practice. And particularly, I think when we're talking about our role in the Pacific, right?
Yeah. And I mean, and we have such a, it doesn't, it doesn't always feel like it when we're in the thick of it, but compared to people doing similar kinds of activism in other parts of the world, we have huge civic freedom to really push the limits and to really hold our leaders to account. And we really need to make sure that we're making the most of that freedom that we do have. And obviously it's different for different people, even in our, it's really important that while we do have civic freedom relatively here in Aotearoa, to make the most of it and kind of stand up for what's right to the best of our abilities and be as brave as we can be, because not everyone can be. And we also have kind of amazing political access because of having a small population, right? Like someone knows, whatever politician, like the politicians know what we do and see what we do in a way that just isn't possible in a larger place. So we do kind of have this extra spark sometimes to our activism that I think is really exciting.
I think that's about it. I think we can wrap the conversation there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So it's March for Peace, Anti-War Aotearoa and Greenpeace working together, noon on Saturday the 20th of June 2026 at Aotea Square. Are there any final things you want to say or call outs you want to do to the public or to our audience about the march or about what Greenpeace hopes to see come out of this?
I think it'd just be great for people to get out there, bring some friends, bring family, make a great placard if you have time. But I think being there is the most important thing. So yeah, it'd be great to see everyone there.
Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to our audience for listening, like, share, subscribe, etc. And hopefully we'll see you at Aotea Square on the 20th of June. We'll catch you next time.